Yeah. So how do we get safely out of the cylinder? Use what is called a reducing valve. Okay. And it reduces pressure within the cylinder down to something usable, which are, as I mentioned, it's 50 psi, and it's also a constant pressure, so it's not having variability. This is what a reducing valve looks like. A couple things that I want to point out with it. First of all, you have you can reduce the cylinder pressure from whatever that higher pressure is down to 50 psi in one step. We call that a one-step regulator. Wow. Or in two steps. And how do you know which is which? You look for these little pressure release valves that are there. If you see one of them, then you know it's a one stage. If you see two of them, you know it's a two stage. Very simply put. Now, a couple of other things that are noted on this. First of all, on the right side, there's something called the ASS, the American Standard Safety System. But larger cylinders have a threaded attachment that's coded for specific gases. Look at a cylinder like the cylinder of oxygen there. This is where the reducing valve hooks up to that allows for it to be attached. Those threads are key for oxygen. Now, there's 140 different codes that are there. How many threads per inch? There's a right thread versus a left-handed thread. But it's far more gases than 140 some. So there's some overlap that exists between them, but they're overlapped in such a fashion that you would never have an oxygen regulator being putting on something harmful. One key factor is any gas that is poisonous is always a backwards thread. So it's always a left-handed thread as opposed to a right-handed thread. Let me grab my regulator. In addition, as you see on this one, this is a female adapter, meaning that a male adapter fits into it. I hopefully don't have to explain what that means to you. Where in some other cases, it's a male adapter that is on the regulator. And it's all dictated by what gas is specifically designed to hook up to. How many stage regulator do I have? I got two pressure relief. I have to have a two-stage regulator. Typically, the stage is 250. So it takes it down from 22 and then 250 to 50. Okay? So this is called the American Standard Safety Systems. And these are designed for large tanks, large cylinders. Okay? Or as we always like to call them, big-ass cylinders. Why big-ass? Because that explains that. Okay? On the other end, you have a diameter index safety system. And diameter index safety systems always are keyed to something that's 100 psi or less. So here's my 50 psi hookup. I'm going to hook up my ventilator to or hook up whatever to. So I've taken it from 2200 down to 50. But that 50 psi point is always a DISS connection. And it's coded, again, based upon the threads per inch that you have for a specific gas, in this case oxygen. If I were to look at an air regulator, totally different connections. Look at a helium connection, totally different. Okay? And the third thing that is there, or maybe the fourth thing, is this part on top which is called the Bourdon gauge. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's basically a gauge that's measuring what pressure is being seen inside the cylinder. Okay? So right now it's pointed to 0 because it's connected to nothing. Wow. Hook it up to a 200 psi source and you'll see that go to 2200. If the cylinder is half full, it'll be 1100. So as the pressure, as the gas is used, the volume of gas in the cylinder goes down, the related pressure will go down also. So they're keyed together. So what this device does is it controls the amount of pressure that is inside the regulator to keep it at a constant. It's really nothing more than a big spring that's pushing against a diaphragm, so that this amount of pressure that is allowed to leak out is kept at a constant point. Okay? And basically in our world, it reduces it down to 50 psi is the ultimate what's coming out of there. Pretty much all of our ventilators, all of our other equipment that we have is all calibrated and designed to run at 50 psi. What's coming out of the wall in the hospital? 50 psi. There is the ability, we don't have these in respiratory therapy, but there is the ability to change how much that outlet pressure is. These are called adjustable high pressure reducing valves. You don't see them. Okay, but they would have a little crank over here that would allow for that to change. But since we're dealing only with 50 psi, there I said it, you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so that's reducing valves. Then there is the concept of a regulator. And a regulator not only reduces the pressure from whatever's inside the cylinder down to 50 psi, it also controls the flow. So it is a flow meter mixed with a reducing valve. Flow meter, reducing valve, regulator. Okay, you add them together. So here, not only do I have my ASS, I also have a single stage reducing valve, but I also have a flow regulating mechanism. Okay? So it's combining the reduction in pressure from some higher pressure down to 50 psi and controlling the flow. Here's another kind of one that would be on a smaller one. We have a different kind of connection mechanism, and we'll talk about that in a sec, called the pin index safety system. But we have a flow meter that with a little float that allows us to be able to measure the flow. Okay, so here I have my regulator. But you can see the different kinds of outlets you end up having. Oops, let me go back there. My American Standard, my DISS outlet, pressure reducing valves. My Bourdon gauge is measuring the pressure inside here. You can't kind of tell, but this is a knob that turns that regulates the flow. So this is actually a regulator, a combination of a reducing valve and a flow meter. Reducing valve, flow meter, regulator. This is designed for a large cylinder. Why? Because it's got a big ass connection. This is designed for a small one. And it's designed a little bit differently in that it has a different kind of connection here that we're going to call a pin index safety system, because it has little pins. Okay? Big ass tanks, little pissy tanks. Just saying if it's a way to remember it. Okay? Same idea. I have a mechanism by which I can reduce the pressure. So it's a reducing valve, and I have my flow control to be able to control flow. And this is actually a gas outlet, a DISS gas outlet with a nipple adapter or a Christmas tree, depending upon who you talk to. More on that later. These are what the pins look like. And these pins are coded for specific gases. So oxygen has a certain pin combination. Air has a totally different one. Heliox is a totally different one. Carbogen is a totally different one. Nitrogen, air, whatever. They're all different. This is what a Bourdon gauge looks like on the inside. Okay? Because what it's doing is it's measuring pressure and translating that into either pressure or, in the case of a flow meter, actually giving us an idea of what the flow is going through it. So I have my pressurized gas that's causing this internal little curvature mechanism to expand or to contract. So as it's a higher pressure, it causes that coil to unfurl, which then causes the needle to move. So this is a pressure measuring device that in the case of a flow, because it could also be used as a flow meter, will give us an idea of what's going on. But it's actually measuring flow. It's called a flow restrictor. So here they are attached to the two types of cylinders. Our DISS are for low pressure outlets, less than 200. So that's why it would be at the end of the flow meter or at the end of the 50 psi outlet. And the ASS is the large connection that would be having attached into the cylinder. And again, they're based on threads, directions of threads, male or female, etc., etc. Big ass, little pissy. And I did not come up with that, although it's pretty good. Oop. Skip that one. It's not really there. We need some safety features built into this. I got 2200 psi. If I got a fire in that room, heat's going to cause what to happen? As temperature goes up, that gas is going to expand, isn't it? So it'll blow up. Do I want shrapnel of metal all over the place? Not a good idea. So there's got to be a mechanism by which we can have, when temperature goes up, the pressure is released, okay, within the cylinder itself. And three different mechanisms exist. One is called a spring-loaded device, where literally, as the pressure reaches a preset level, a spring opens up and allows the gas to escape. The second one is something called a frangible disc, which is a metal disc that melts at a specific temperature and bursts. And a fusible plug is basically excessive pressure will cause increase in temperature and will melt the plug. So all three mechanisms could be used in some fashion. So here's my spring-loaded device. And basically, when the pressure exceeds what the tension of that spring is, it vents the gas out. My frangible disc, when the pressure gets stronger than what that disc is, it vents the pressure out. And a fusible plug basically melts and releases the pressure. Spring-loaded disc, frangible disc, spring-loaded device, frangible disc, fusible plug. You may want to remember those three names. They all do the same thing. A lot of pressure, vent it. Some other DISS connections that are specific. Again, this male piece fits into this female piece. They're both designed to only accept the same gas, which is oxygen. Nicely, they're colored green. Why? Because green is the color, universal color for oxygen in the United States. You can see that this air connection would not fit into that, but would fit into that one. If you can't see it, believe me, you can. It's like trying to put a round peg in a square hole. It just doesn't fit. Okay? And it's safety. You don't want the ability to hook something up that wasn't designed to be hooked up with. Okay? Usually they're color-coded, yes. I'm not going to say always, because then I would probably be lying to you. Because you know I lie. So here's the ASS connection. You can see there's you can't really see, but there's a threaded outlet on the cylinder and a threaded mechanism on the connecting nipple, and that hex nut just tightens. So the threads that are inside here match the threads that are on the outside of the cylinder, and they line up and they attach just by tightening down. So that's the American Standard Safety System. And different threading and cylinder outlets prevent accidental misconnections. Smaller cylinders, same idea. We want to be able to make sure we don't put a cylinder of oxygen onto a regulator of air. So we use these combination of pins that attach where the on what is called the yoke, and that screws off the process. Need to make sure that it's level so you're not cross-threading these, because it's very easy to end up doing. These are used on small AA through E cylinders. And this is just talking about the fact that incorrect, believe me, there's ways to get around the system. You know, people will do all kind of crazy things, as you saw last time where the guy tried to take the cylinder valve off and ended up losing his arm. But again, the FDA and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health are basically folks that come up with standards that say that in order to maintain safety with gas cylinders, you got to follow these rules. So this is the pin index safety system that we end up having, and you can see there's any two pins, except for adjacent numbers, could be used. So I could have 1, 3, I could have 2, 4, I could have 2, 5, I could have 1, 6, but I could never have 1, 2, because they cross. Does that make sense? Okay. You could never have 2 adjacent. You could never have 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, etc. What do I want you to know from this slide? Very first one. If you're a geek and me, you might want to measure the other ones. 1626 CO2 and O2, 24 heliox. Why? I don't know. Because I'm weird. Cyclopropane and ethylene, two examples of poisonous gases that you might, well, ethylene you might see in the hospital, but it's not something we would ever come in contact with. Remember ethylene oxide? We used it for sterilization. Sure, nod your head. You don't remember that. I can guarantee you. 2,5. It's the one you want to remember. So again, take a look before you hook. Yeah, whatever. That way we won't get into trouble. So how about flow metering devices? These are basically two different mechanisms by which we control flow. So if I had the regulator being a combination of a pressure reducing valve and a flow meter. Let's talk about that flow meter part of it. There are 3 general types of flow meters that exist and that you may encounter. The most common one is something called a Thorpe tube, okay, which is this kind of a system. Takes my 50 psi outlet coming out of the pressure reducing valve and regulates the flow, where I would hook something up to a DISS outlet. And this is what the picture looks like. So let me go ahead and talk about them. DISS, this is where it plugs into the wall, which unfortunately we won't have the opportunity to do because we don't have any wall oxygen. I then have a pressure takeoff. So let's say I wanted to have this flow meter in the wall, but I also wanted it hooked up to a ventilator. Like this is a 50 psi source. And if I attach a ventilator hose to it, it'll pressurize the ventilator in the process. If I don't have anything hooked up to it, nothing is there. I then have my Thorpe tube, which is the fancy name for the little plastic part that rises up. And there's a little small float that is there. Some people refer to as a ball, because it usually is a ball. There's a DISS outlet, 50 psi in, 50 psi, potentially 50 psi out, but it never really gets that high because that flow meter controls it, but it's still considered a DISS outlet. And then there's a flow control, that I can control the amount of flow just by turning the knob. And the way I use this is when I plug it into the wall, I adjust this control knob until the float is where I want it as far as the amount of liters per minute, which is what these are calibrated at. So if I want it at 5 liters per minute, I turn it until the float sits at 5 at eye level, which means for short people, well, never mind. There are also 50 psi quick connects that we would end up using to allow it to quickly have connection to an outlet. And on the opposite side, obviously, is a 50 psi DISS adapter. So there is something in the world called a non-pressure compensated flow meter. If you ever see one, other than in a museum, quietly get into your car and slowly drive away from that institution, because they have been out of use since I started. I saw one once. But what will end up happening is, as you pop a flow meter that's turned off, you pop it into the wall, you'll actually see the float bounce. Bloop, because it's pressurizing that portion between where the end of it is and where the outlet is. And the other thing is, they're pressure regulated in the sense that if I occlude this outlet with my thumb, that float will actually come back down to zero. So a pressure regulated flow meter always reads the correct flow. Pressure regulated Thorpe tube flow meter always reads the correct flow, even in the face of downstream obstruction. So if I take and I got this hooked up to some tubing, and I kink the tubing, that'll actually drop down with the kink. So it's reading the actual flow. It's telling me that the patient's not getting any flow in the process. Tells you exactly what's going on. And this is just basically talking about why we don't care. It's talking about pressure difference and blah, 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 blah. And here we end up seeing the effect of obstructing it. And again, this is that pressure uncompensated, which wouldn't do that, which, again, I think you might see in a museum. Second type is called a Bourdon gauge. And again, it has the ability to regulate pressure, so I have my pressure reducing component, but I also have a flow measuring component. The problem here is it doesn't give you the correct flow. If I occlude, I actually might have a slight increase in pressure. Okay? So a Bourdon gauge does not read downstream pressure correctly in the face of obstruction. Why the hell would we use them? Thorpe tube requires it to be vertical. What do I do when I have it attached to a cylinder that I'm transporting somebody? I lay it on its side. Oops. Thorpe tube doesn't read accurate anymore. This one will. So there's different uses for different reasons. If I'm using it on a cylinder for transport, Bourdon gauge is a whole lot better. If I'm using it for measuring flow where the thing's going to be vertical all the time, like in a patient room, Thorpe tube works fine. This is just talking about in the face of back pressure what ends up happening. We already talked about that. Third type of flow meter is called a flow restrictor. And you'll see these on a lot of home care devices. And basically, as I turn the knob to whatever the flow I've desired is, all I'm doing is adjusting it as far as which opening it's passing through. So if it's passing through a very small opening, my flow is going to be very low. If I'm passing it through a very big outlet, flow is going to be very high. So as I go from an eighth of a liter, seriously? Yeah, you can say eighth of a liter to 2 liter, I go from eighth of a liter to 2 liter. And all I'm doing is just changing which opening it's passing through. And I can do this either as a variable one, which I just showed, or as a fixed one. So it's a fixed outlet that will give me a constant flow through it when hooked up to a 50 psi source. And examples of these are something like this. So if I wanted to have 5 liters per minute, I just hook up this 5-liter flow restrictor, and the flow will always be at 5 liters per minute. Why do I want that? For breathing treatments a lot of time. I can just take a 50 psi quick connect, hook it to one of these nipple adapters, pop it in the wall, and I got 5 liters. No more, no less. The same thing that's going on the left-hand side. And again, all it's doing is a different size opening, different size flow. Smaller opening, less flow. Bigger opening, more flow. So attaching this regulator to my cylinder. First of all, identify the cylinder, make sure we have the correct one, and we do that by looking at the label. Don't always trust the color. 99 times out of 100, it's going to be correct. But look at the label. Secure it in our stand or our cart. We crack open the cylinder, right? Literally. Open it up for just a brief moment. Any dust or debris that may be accumulated inside the opening where the gas is coming out is now blown out. And it's not blown into my regulator. On small cylinders, they have a small washer that is there. I don't think I have an example. I'll have to find them, see if I can find one. But larger cylinders don't, but smaller cylinders do. We attach and tighten the regulator. We set the pressure and flow correctly. And then when we're done, we turn off the cylinder, empty the regulator, and remove it. So we're always having the cylinder stored with no pressure inside of it. So I can leave this attached to my cylinder, but when I'm done with it, I want to turn off the valve on the cylinder top and then allow the gas to bleed out so that this isn't being maintained pressurized while it's not doing anything. Makes sense. I'm sure there's an analogy. I can think of someplace, but I can't think of one. So we always want to make sure our regulator is in the off position. Slowly open it, and then slowly open it further till it's open all the way, and we close it basically as we go back. What if there's a leak? For large cylinder, wimpy thing, just didn't tighten this down tight enough. And I know you guys work with hand tools all the time, but there is a little bit of leverage you got to have there. And make sure that we have the correct threading on there. Okay. For small cylinders, it's almost always the washer. And we'll see it's a little piece of plastic that fits between the two pieces, the yoke and the cylinder head itself. Could also be that the regulator is damaged, or it could be the cylinder valve is defective, in which case you want to get out that crescent wrench and go ahead and try it. I'm kidding. If you have a flow meter that's leaking, it could be that the needle valve is worn. It could be that the leading valve is leaking and you need to have it do some maintenance on it. And again, basically, if you've got a leak, pull it out of service and let whoever is in charge of doing repair it. When I was a geek, I used to like to do stuff like that and repair stuff. Big surprise, I know. Okay, if the patient doesn't feel any flow or becomes short of breath, make sure that we have the proper functioning flow meter and there's no obstruction. And again, it's the beauty of a compensated third tube because it'll read accurately. And then we're not going to do this practicing, but you should have an idea. So now cylinders, we used to do a performance evaluation of you taking off and putting on a regulator onto a cylinder. Now they don't do that anymore. Now they have what is called a grab and go, that the regulator is permanently attached to the cylinder. So all you have to do is literally pick it up, turn it on, and you're going. You don't have to attach anything to it. Boo hiss. That was part of the fun, was attaching a regulator to it. Okay? And when they're done, they just return the empty cylinder back to the manufacturer and they refill it, and everything's wonderful. Okay, we talked about this, I believe, in 1060. Calculation the duration of a cylinder's use. Be prepared for at least one question of this nature. This is very common. So I use the factor of 0.28 for an E cylinder and 3.14 for an H cylinder. Where those numbers come from, I can tell you if you really want to know. My guess is you could give a rat's rectal tissue, and all you want to know is I need to know those two, one for an E and one for an H. So that's the cylinder conversion factor that's placed. I know the PSI on the gauge. That's what the G stands for, pressures, pounds per square inch gauge. Why does it say that? Because you already have 14.7 from atmospheric pressure. So really, the gauge is reading less 14.7. So anyway, whatever that pressure is there, multiply by the cylinder factor, divide it by what the liter flow that the patient's going to be on. It'll give me the duration in minutes. So for instance, if I have 1,000 psi H cylinder attached to a nasal cannula running at 6 liters, I'm going to go ahead and just and we want this to run until empty, which normally is not the case, but 1,000 psi times 3.14 divided by 6 is 523 minutes. Divide that 523 minutes by 60 is 8 hours. Multiply that 0.72 by 60 and we get 43 minutes. And if you don't remember how to end up doing that, I think there's some stuff from 1060 that we went through this, and there's problems in Cybersyn if you have that book that'll allow you to go ahead and practice. Now, we don't normally let cylinders run until they're completely empty. Usually, a large cylinder we stop at 200 psi, a small cylinder we stop at 500. So we estimate what duration will it be until we get to that point in time. I'm going to tell you a story. When I first started, there was one of my clinical sites that did not have piped-in oxygen in the hospital except in the ICU. So on the general care floors, there was no piped-in gas. If a patient was on oxygen, we rolled an H cylinder to the room and did these calculations. People look at me like, are you kidding me? No. It was a very old hospital that is no longer in existence. Now, I mean, every patient room has at least one, if not multiple, oxygen outlets. But for our purposes for the course, if I say running until the cylinder is empty, ignore this. If I say running until the departmental policy says to change it, it's 200 for an H, 500 for a E cylinder. So what I would do then is if I had an E cylinder, look at the pounds per square inch. I'm sorry, this is an H cylinder, minus 200. If it's an E cylinder, minus 500. Figure out what that pressure is, then multiply that to by my cylinder factor. And there's E cylinder for a smaller one. So here's an example. I got an E cylinder at 1,500 psi and my patient's on a 2-liter nasal cannula. So 1,500 minus 500 is 1,000 times 0.28 divided by 2 liters is 140 minutes, which works out to 2 hours and 18 minutes if you do the math on that. So I pretty much guarantee you'd probably see an E cylinder or an H or an H cylinder problem on Thursday's test. There, I warned you. Some stuff in Cybersyn. So just some common sense stuff. What should you do if you enclose in a closet or a car trunk? Remove it and put it in a well-ventilated area. Common sense. If it's by a heat source, what are you, stupid? Get it out of there. Cylinders near cleaning chemicals. Great idea, yeah. No, get it out of there. Cylinders in a room with flammable gases. It's not supposed to be stored. Flammable, non-flammable, and support combustion are stored separately. Freestanding. Chain it up. That sounds wrong, but okay. Therapist is mishandling a cylinder. Do not drop, swing, or collide. Yahoo! How can you see that one happen? Do not carry it by the regulator or the reducing valve. You don't carry a cylinder like this. You definitely don't carry an H cylinder like this because you could never be able to lift it. But second of all, you carry an E cylinder like this. and 2 hands, so that you're able to support it. Using oxygen regulator on a heliox cylinder, bad. Because I'm now using a regulator that's not calibrated for that gas. Liquid, remember liquid? Not that liquid. Not if it's got a olive floating in it. That's not the kind of liquid I'm talking about here. Okay. Basically, liquid systems are just like large thermoses. They're able to keep this gas that is inside in a liquid state, which means you have to pressurize it and you have to cool it immensely. Once it's allowed to release, then it passes through a vaporizer, which causes that pressure to be slowly reduced to atmospheric pressure. And then you have your pressure reducing valve that gets it to our pressure we want to utilize at 50 psi. If you go out to any hospital and you look outside in the back, you'll see a big one of these, at least one, if not 2, usually 2. Nope. So a true gas is a gas that boils at room temperature, something like oxygen. We talked about what vapor is. We know about water vapor. We know about the boiling point. Now, the boiling point at 1 atmosphere for oxygen is minus 183 degrees Celsius. Do I want you to know that number? No, but know that it's damn cold. How's that? Okay. Above its boiling point, the only way you can get it into a liquid state is if you pressurize it. So combination of cold and pressure will take gaseous oxygen and put it into the liquid state, which is what that thing here does. Pressurizes it, cools it, makes it from a liquid, or takes it from gas and puts it into a liquid. Man, there is nothing on this I can think of asking you, except for absolute zero is minus 273 Celsius. That seems fair, right? 0 degrees Kelvin. So concept of critical temperature, the highest temperature it can go without being converted to a gas. Critical pressure, the pressure that is needed to maintain that critical temperature. So together they're called a triple point, or critical point. So it boils up at minus 183, it's critical temp, at which it can only be maintained in the liquid state is minus 118, which is what this slide shows here. So if I decrease the pressure, I'm going to allow that temperature to rise, and what you end up having is it converting into a gas. So let's just talk a little bit about what the comparison is. Full cylinder of oxygen is usually at 2200 psi, which if you do the mathematics on that, it comes out to about 150 atmospheres. A lot of pressure. Why is it still a gas in the cylinder when it's under so much pressure? It's because it's at room temperature. Okay? And no matter how much pressure is applied, you can't turn that liquid back into you can't turn it back into a liquid. On the other hand, the liquid cylinders, the liquid systems, are normally kept at about minus 163. Don't need to worry about that. And about 25 psi. The container itself is called a dewar, D-E-W-A-R, dewar. What we do then is allow that gas to cool and gradually the pressure to equalize with atmospheric. And in the process, you end up having that liquid converted into a gas. An example, there's only one example I'm aware of going from a solid to a gaseous state without passing through a liquid state, and that's carbon dioxide. And you should know that that process is called sublimation. You guys have all seen dry ice, right? It's great on Halloween. You put it in a drink and cools the drink, but it also in the process looks pretty sexy. Now, two things. There are some gases, because of their critical temperature and critical pressure, are in a liquid state at room temperature. The two most common one we'll encounter are nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is a liquid at room temperature. Because of that, we have to weigh the cylinder to know how much it is. And let me kind of see if I got a picture of that. So here's my carbon dioxide cylinder. Let's first start with oxygen. Notice that as we start depleting the amount of oxygen, the gauge goes down. So as I start using some of the volume of oxygen in an oxygen cylinder, the amount of pressure that's going to be related on that valve goes down, or the gauge. Yes? Look at CO2. That SOB is lying to me. It's filled with liquid and some gas, and as that liquid is depleted, it's converted into the gas, and it's not until only gas is in there that it will start having the gauge fall. So long as there's some liquid within the cylinder, you'll never see a change in the gauge. So how do I know how much is left in the cylinder? I have to weigh it. So when it's totally full, it's going to read this pressure, let's say 2,000. When it's half empty, what's the gauge going to read? 2,000. When it's a quarter empty, 2,000. That ain't true with oxygen, but it's only true with these ones that are in the liquid state. Like I said, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. They're kind of funky. So again, think of those dewars as just a big thermos bottle, because it's keeping it at a constant temperature. Don't care that you know it's minus 160 degrees Celsius and a certain pressure. Turn the flow meter on, it passes through those vaporizer coils, allowing it to reduce itself in pressure and become a vapor as opposed to becoming staying in a liquid. These are some of these large stationary units that we end up having in the patient's home. This one in the center here is a portable unit, and we can transfill from the big one to the little one. There's a diagram of what it looks like, and you can see the same concept, the insulation, the vaporizer coils, and my oxygen outlet. Here's an example of Mr. somebody or other with his Helios. 6:30 in the morning, he's going out shopping with his wife. 3:30 in the afternoon. This is why this is such a false slide. He looks happy at 3:30 after shopping with his wife all that point in time. I would put needles through my eyes. But the point being is that he can have a whole lot of duration of oxygen flow in the process. Doesn't take much time to fill these things. That's the beauty of them. And again, at 2 liters per minute, you can end up getting, depending upon how much brand you have, up to almost a full day of use just on a liquid. So that's huge.
Are these more effective than using like an actual oxygen tank hooked up to the back of the wheelchair?
For duration purposes.
For duration.
Because they last longer.
Okay. So
Still 100% oxygen. Now, we talked last time.
I wasn't here, but I've listened
I know,
to
but about the oxygen concentrators.
Yeah.
Now they don't attain 100% oxygen. These do. These in cylinders do have 100%. Why don't you see these used more often? Cost. So it's got a carrying strap, and it's got a switch, which we'll talk about, continuous versus demand. Continuous meaning the flow is continuous. Demand means it's only going in during inspiration. There's a flow control knob. This is a little meter that tells you, you can just hold it and it'll go ahead and tell you how much is in there. So we're using weight kind of as a mechanism. No. I hate labeling. So the downside to liquid compared to a cylinder, another downside beside cost, is that it evaporates off. It leaks off. If you have this sitting with no flow going through it, it'll eventually bleed itself off. One of the downsides. But we're not talking about a large amount.
And how many liters of liquid does it hold?
Depends on the size of the reservoir.
Okay.
And I would never ask you that. What I do want you to know is that very top line, well, yeah, 1 liter of liquid oxygen weighs 2.5 pounds and will expand to 860 gaseous liters. 1 liter of liquid weighs 2.5 pounds and will expand to 860 gaseous liters. Remember this one? That was from 1060. Don't cry. Think you'll see this one again? Oh yeah, baby. So what I do is I figure out how much gas is in the liquid reservoir itself. I weigh it, multiply that by 860, divide it by 2.5. I then take that value and I can go ahead and figure out the duration. So here I have 5 pounds times 860 divided by 2.5, which works out to 1,720 liters of gaseous oxygen. So that 5 pounds means that I'll have 1,720 gaseous liters. Then take that 1,720 and divide it by 2 liters, and I get 860 minutes, which works out to something better than 14 hours. Vaguely coming back through the fog.
It was like the last.
It was one of the last tests. Yep. I remember that. So just another example, I end up having a 10-pound system. So 10 pounds times 860 divided by 2.5 means I have 3,440 liters divided by the 3 liters per minute, and I find out that I have just over 19 hours and 7 minutes, or almost 7 minutes. So again, storage these things in a cool, dry, well-ventilated area. If you're in the hospital, now it's no longer an issue because hospitals are smoke-free campuses, but we used to always have to put signs outside saying that smoking, there's no smoking inside this room because the patient's on oxygen. And you saw the wonderful video of the moron who didn't follow those little things. Never use unlabeled cylinders, transport properly, no oil or petroleum products, and transfill only by recommendation of the manufacturer. Now, one thing about transfilling of a liquid system, it's at a very, very cold temperature. You can literally get frostbite from touching the outlet. It's designed so that you never have to touch it. But if some moron goes, hey, look at all the frost on this, you'd be like on with Ralphie and his little friend who got his tongue stuck to the flagpole. Moron. So 3 ways: gas, liquid, and concentrators. Some of the advantages and disadvantages we've kind of talked about. Primarily we'll use gas cylinders for transport within the hospital or as a backup in the home. And the reason why you don't use them more is because they're big, bulky. Liquid systems can be used primarily in the home. When I was a manager, we actually used liquid for transports. I reduced my cylinder usage amazingly. And then concentrators are pretty much exclusively in the home. The nice part now is that we have portable concentrators that you can take on the plane and fly to Florida with and not have to worry about what am I going to do when we get off the plane. Talk a lot of rigmarole. you know, Uncle Louie's going down to Florida, or is going to Vegas, right? On the plane, he was using the oxygen from the plane, we had to arrange for a home care company to be at the airport when he got off the plane. What a nightmare. 66, oh, good thing we talked about this one before. Home oxygen continuously, rarely leaves the house. Again, primarily would use a portable concentrator, although you could also use a gas cylinder, so E would be the correct answer. Oh. How about D? Actually, I don't know if I agree with that one. Use ambulation during the day. This is where you want to have something with with a portable concentrator. Ambulating during the day. And again, in this case, same thing. I like this one. All right, let me continue on for this last part. But I think to suffer through this, we need another video.
There he goes.
Don't worry about it. It wasn't right.
This is going to be hilarious.
Well, he doesn't see.
No, he has no idea. Hey, that's littering!
All false, that would have to be.
Hey, don't forget your coffee! Oh, it's beautiful.
Friends. All right. So again, we talked about these bulk systems. This is kind of what the reservoir would look like. You actually have two reservoirs there. One is your primary and one is your backup. And they just store large quantities of liquid oxygen. And they're usually backed up by a manifold system or by a secondary reservoir. It's my reserve. You can see the vaporizing coils there also that reduce that pressure and convert the liquid into a gas. We saw pictures of these before. I'm not going to ask you to label anything. Cool part is that because this is so cold, you end up actually seeing ice form on them even in the hottest day in the summer, because the temperature that it's initially coming out at is still so cold. A manifold system is where we end up having multiple large cylinders bulked together, tied together. Okay, so there usually are two sets of cylinders, so 3 cylinders and 3 cylinders. One is a reserve, one is what we use. When the use side empties, we flip a switch and knock it over to the other side. This is an example of a nitrous oxide bank system. So one side is always in reserve, one side is always in use. When an alarm goes off that says that the in-use size has fallen to a certain pressure, okay, then I know for one that it's converted all that liquid into a gas. So now all that's left is gas. Someone goes down, flips it over, and changes out the liquid, the use side. Then when they're done, they flip it back.
We would never have to do that, right?
Oh, depends where you work. Never say never. And one of the things I learned in my career is that you always have a backup manifold sitting in a closet someplace for oxygen, just in case you lose oxygen in the building.
This is for the whole hospital.
This is feeding all the ORs.
Okay. So there's several of them that I'm guessing, not just,
No, not usually.
no?
Not usually. So here we have a couple different banks, and again, there's this mechanism by which it tells when one side is low and it sends an alarm and tells everybody to flip it over. This is another diagram that you end up having there, and I don't expect you to label these. You can also have this bank of cylinders permanently stationed someplace in the hospital, or you can have them on a trailer and roll it in. Now, this gets a little bit into the weeds, so I'll try to just point out what I want you to know with this. So this is what happens when the hospital. Outside I have my liquid reservoir. Then there's a pipe that runs in, underground typically, obviously for obvious reasons, and it goes to various spots within the hospital, either on the same level or on a second or third or fourth or however many floors in the hospital have oxygen pipe to them. Okay? There are within these various zone valves where the oxygen from that zone feeds a specific part of the hospital, a specific wing, a specific floor, a specific unit. Okay? I told you my story about how they were digging the footing for a portable MRI, and the backhoe cut this line, and we lost oxygen to the hospital. That's an oh shit moment. Big time. Middle of the day, 12 ORs, 20 ICU beds, no problem. So that zone valve becomes very important. We talked about flow metering devices used on cylinders, also used onto the wall outlet. We get gas coming out of the wall, same idea. We have a reducing valve that's within the piping system itself that reduces it from whatever higher pressure down to 50, and the flow meter plugs into the wall in this fashion. Has anybody had an opportunity to plug a flow meter into a wall? Okay, a couple of you. One of the things I'm going to ask you to see if you can get the second years to do when you go to visit later this month is to have them have you pop a flow meter and release a flow meter into the wall. It's a little bit of a, it's not difficult by any stretch, but popping it out, you got to be a little more cautious because there's a lot of pressure behind there, 50 psi. But here's an example of a Thorpe tube flow meter plugged into an oxygen outlet. And again, we talked about these DISS connections. Why DISS? Because it's less than 200 psi. In fact, in this case, it's 50 psi. Oxygen and air, how do I know? Color. Not perfect, but I plug a flow meter in the wall and I got a huge amount of leak. Try to reconnect it. If you still got the leak, contact maintenance. There's something wrong with the outlet. And we saw this in the lab. Some of the outlets in the lab had this problem. Gas leaking from flow meter is turned off. That needle valve may be damaged or the wall connection may be. So now obviously some maintenance is needed there also. Thorpe tube ball does not return to zero when turned off. Needs to be recalibrated or repaired. And the patient doesn't feel any flow. We talked about this. Check for an obstruction. We go down these safety systems. Big ass, pissy little. Okay? So the PISS is on small cylinders less than E. The American Standard Safety System is used on large cylinders. And the DISS is anything that has to do with something less than 200 psi. Usually, a hospital has to have 1 day of support somewhere and backup, be it in cylinders, whatever. And we know there's alarms that alert us to the fact, and there's zone valves within. There's our backup reservoir or backup cylinders. And if you walk by any unit, you'll end up seeing a panel like this that'll alarm if the gas falls below a certain critical threshold point. Usually it's 50 psi. If it falls below 50, it starts alarming. And who do you think the health unit clerk will call if it starts alarming? Call us. So for some reason or other, we're not attaining our gas pressure. Most ventilators will run on something above 35 psi. So even though it's not seeing exactly 50s, it still operate. And here's our zone valve. We have one of these inside E-building. And one of the things that you will eventually get to use is the skill in opening and closing zone valves. Somewhere in E-building, we have a leak. So if we use the piped-in gas and use it from because we have one of those manifold systems for oxygen. But if we use it, it'll drain the cylinders. And I don't know, maybe they'll repair it now that we got the walls all tore down. But you can see there's one for oxygen, one for air, and one for vacuum, and you can see they each have their own gauge that shows what the pressures in those systems are. So, a process called backfeeding. This is something that everybody says, oh, you'll never use this. Believe me, you'll use this at some point. If nothing else, you use it in the lab in the fall when we get back in there. So what we want to do is close off a zone valve. Let's say that zone valve was room 109. Room 109 has probably, I'm going to guess 11 or 12 oxygen outlets. If I close that zone valve and I plug a cylinder into any one of those outlets, any of the other outlets will be pressurized from that cylinder. So I'm basically tricking it into thinking that I have an entire cylinder in operation. Why do I do that? Because I want to I want to plug a ventilator in and I want to be able to use it in the fall to do whatever. But I don't want to use the oxygen that's in the system because I know there's a leak. We use it in the hospital all the time when I got construction. They're building a brand new wing. At some point, they need to tie into the oxygen that is already there in the other portion. But during that time, I got to shut off the oxygen throughout the hospital or throughout a particular riser or whatever. Guess what? We got to backfeed everything. And we talked about that emergency bulk loss, like when a backhoe hits the line coming in. Oops. So by closing a zone valve, we isolate it, and then we can hook up that reducing valve with an 8-cylinder of 50 psi oxygen to power all the other outlets. This procedure is posted on the wall, and when we get back in the fall, we'll go ahead and show you how to end up backfeeding. It's going to be one of the critical things you're going to end up needing to do, because if you're here on a weekend, you want to practice with the ventilators in the fall, which you may or may not want to be. You'll have to know how to do this. Some other things, just miscellaneous. First of all, an air compressor. You guys have all seen air compressors, right? You go to Bell Tire, fill up your tires with air. That's an air compressor. All it's doing is through a piston and a motor pressurizing a system. So it compresses the gas from 14.7 to 50 psi. As we will find when we hook these up in for lab, they are noisier than shit. That's all we got. They also release heat, so they get very warm very quickly, so you want to make sure it's a well-ventilated area. And they may also, because I'm compressing air's got humidity in it, you could have humidity coming back out, so there's condensation traps that we end up having. Don't need to label this, but this is a little portable compressor. Here's another example of a small portable compressor that a patient would use in their home to deliver breathing treatments. Boy, that looks familiar. Small volume nebulizer. I think Lori may have talked about those.
I put a pillow over my son's because it's so damn loud. Is that okay?
It'll build up heat.
Oh, it's the noise. He's trying to sleep.
Second thing, blenders. Blenders, as the name implies, blends gases. Wow. It takes 50 psi 100% oxygen, 50 psi 21% oxygen, 79% nitrogen, so air, blends them together, and by turning a knob, I can get a specific FiO2. So here's an example of one. Again, I don't care that you can label it, but just knowing that I turn this knob from 60 to 50, coming out of my outlet, I'm going to have 50% gas. It's a way to blend the gases together. So we don't have a lab, so we can't practice that, but we'll stop there.
Probably not going to do the oxygen one at all then.
Oxygen 1 at all.
The oxygen
Hold on one sec.